So, hi everyone. My name is Christina Cardona. I am a faculty member here at CCBC Essex and teach environmental science, oceanography, earth science, and anything earth related. But I'm also the chair of the book selection committee for the Community Book Connection. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Book Connection, what we do is it's a democratically elected process where my committee selects the top finalists for the book of the year that is based on faculty, student, and staff recommendations. We select the top 2 or 3 candidates, and then anyone at CCBC can vote for their favorite book based on that finalist selection. So for the year, the academic year of 2022-2023, we have Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Colbert, which is about environmental issues related to everything and anything from overharvesting, pollution, habitat loss, and ocean acidification, global warming affecting coral reefs, which is a section of this book. That is why we have selected to discuss coral reefs that are at risk from both global warming and ocean acidification as our discussion point for today. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to give a survey, and those that fill it out are put in a raffle to win some gift certificates. So please fill out the survey. Is there someone having trouble being able to hear me?
Christina, I'm taking care of it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I just saw that on the note. But we have faculty here from the environmental science and earth science departments to discuss the issues with coral reefs. And we're going to start with Dr. Jenny Allen, who's going to describe the causes of these problems, followed by Dr. Jaworski, who is going to talk about the consequences of these pollutants on coral reefs. And finally, I will discuss some solutions that are available. So at this time, I'm going to let Dr. Allen start. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to give a minute just to make sure everyone can hear okay before we get started, because it sounds like some folks are having
technical
problems. Yeah.
Seems like I can't find the thing to mute myself either, which is what I'm trying to do right now. There we go.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Is it just a few people that are having issues? Can you give a thumbs up or something if you can see the presentation and you can hear me?
Or post in the chat if you can hear.
Post in the chat. Yeah. Okay. I see a couple thumbs.
Okay, good. I know.
Okay. So
yeah, it seems there's a few people. I'm going to encourage them to go out and come back in, which is kind of the usual.
Turn off and turn back on.
Yep.
Okay. Do I just tell you when to change slides? Is that how we're doing it? Okay, no problem at all. You can just keep it on the screen for a moment, because before we get in, I just wanted to open it up and ask everybody to kind of get an idea of what everybody knows or thinks about coral reefs and what the issues are that coral reefs are exhibiting. So you can either jump in on chat and just type some of the risks that coral reefs are experiencing, or you can unmute and say it out loud. What are some issues that coral reefs might be facing? Oh, and I should turn my video on, sorry. Okay. All right, I see global warming, ocean acidification, excellent. Global climate change. Good, anybody else? All right, we can go ahead to, pollution. Excellent, great. All things that are definitely impacting coral reefs. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this graphic here on the screen is showing some of those potential threats to coral reefs. We're going to focus primarily on the warming ocean and on ocean acidification. But there are other things that it's important to note that there are other issues that are surrounding coral reefs. As we are experiencing climate change and warming temperatures, we're having ice melt, we're losing glaciers. And so a lot of the sea level is rising, which as water gets higher, it's bringing in more sediment, which coral reefs need. They like shallow water with a lot of abundant sunlight. So as sediment covers the water, covers the coral reefs, that's potential both smothering the corals with the sediment landing on top of them, but also blocking sunlight. That also that correlates with changes in precipitation as we're seeing more rainfall, not just more rainfall, but more intense rainfall. We're getting more runoff, which is bringing more sediment into the water. It's also bringing pollutants into the water, and those pollutants can lead to potentials like algae blooms, which can, as the algae grows, it blocks sunlight over the corals. It also brings in more sediment, similar to what I mentioned with the sea level rise. And so those are both threats in terms of impacting the coral reefs. But the two I really want to focus today is on the warming ocean and ocean acidification. Can you see my cursor as I move it around?
I don't think so.
On the screen? No, because I don't have control over the screen. Okay, so never mind.
You want me to point?
It's okay.
Yes.
It's all right. Okay, so climate change. A few people mentioned that climate change is a big threat to coral reefs. So with climate change, we have what's happening is we're putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases are found naturally in the atmosphere, and their job is to trap heat and push it back down onto the planet. It's the reason that we have a moderate climate and we have life on this planet. However, we're adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and greenhouse gases, their only job is to trap heat, and they're very good at it. So the more we're adding, the more heat we're trapping, and the warmer the planet is getting. And so we'll talk more about the impacts of that in just a minute. The other impact is we're putting more greenhouse gases, specifically CO2, we're increasing and changing the chemistry of the ocean and leading to ocean acidification. And before I move into the next slide, I just want to make sure to emphasize that climate change and ocean acidification are two different phenomenons that are happening because of changes in CO2, right? So we have warming temperatures and we have increased CO2 that's changing the chemistry of the ocean. They're often referred to as the evil twins because they're both causing issues that are related but are completely separate and causing separate issues, okay? Can everybody make sure they're muted just so we don't have any feedback? Thank you. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about rising CO2 levels. Why are we seeing increases in CO2 levels in the atmosphere? Can anybody pop in the chat and tell us why? Any thoughts as to why there's more CO2 in the atmosphere? More corporate plant emissions. Good. Fossil fuel. Excellent. Yeah. So as we're using more fossil fuels, we're burning more CO2 and releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere. So this first graph in the upper left is CO2 concentrations over the last 60 years or so. So there's an observatory in Hawaii that's been monitoring daily CO2 concentrations since the early 1960s. And what you can see is that the CO2 concentrations have increased over 100 parts per million, ppm. They were in the 300s in 1960, and we're up to over 420 currently in the atmosphere. So as a follow-up question to the CO2 concentrations increasing, does anybody know why the graph, if you see, Dr. Cardona, if you could kind of just highlight the up and down points on the graph. Does anybody know what those fluctuations are along the graph? Why it goes up and down like that? Any thoughts? Springtime uses a lot of CO2. Excellent, great. Yeah, so those up and down reflects the seasonal changes, right? So in the wintertime, in wherever around the world where it gets cold, plants, the majority of the plants drop their leaves. Trees, plants, all of those are extremely important for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So when they're no longer during the winter, when they're lying dormant, they're not taking as much CO2 out. And so you tend to see more CO2 in the atmosphere. And then springtime, summer comes along, plants start growing again, leaves come back out, they start taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere. So you can actually see the seasonal fluctuations reflected in the chart. But overall, even with the help of our plants, CO2 is still increasing. So as it's increasing in the atmosphere, it's also increasing in the ocean. So oceans, they are amazing and take out a lot of our CO2. They've absorbed approximately 30% of the CO2 that we've seen, which is important because if it wasn't taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere, our CO2 levels in the atmosphere would be about 50% higher than they currently are. So it's really important. The ocean serves as a great carbon storage for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere for us. So this other graph we have on the bottom right is showing that same red line is atmospheric CO2. The green points is showing CO2 increases in the ocean. So you can see it follows the same trend. There's a lot of fluctuation, but it follows the same general trend. And then you can see the blue lines down at the bottom, that reflects pH. So those are the changes that we're starting to see in the pH in the ocean. So if we can go to the next slide. And as the ocean is taking in more CO2, in order to really understand the impact, we need to understand a little bit of chemistry. So as CO2 gets taken into the ocean, the CO2 dissolves in the water and it binds with the water and it forms carbonic acid. Once the carbonic acid is formed, it then breaks apart into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And it's the release of those free hydrogen ions that changes the pH of the ocean. So pH is a measure of hydrogen ions in the water. The more hydrogen ions you have in the water, the more acidic the pH is. So as the CO2 gets dissolved in the water, the carbonic acid is formed, and then that breaks apart and forms hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The bigger problem, in addition to just releasing the hydrogen ions, is some of those free hydrogen ions, then bind to the available carbonate ions that are in the water and form more of that bicarbonate. So carbonate is extremely important in the ocean because that's what marine organisms use to form calcium carbonate. So that calcium forms with the carbonates to form calcium carbonate. So as the hydrogen ions are taking up that available carbonate, there's less carbonate available for the marine organisms to use that calcium carbonate. And those marine organisms, things like crabs, clams, lobsters, sea urchins, all kinds of organisms that have a hard shell, use the calcium carbonate to build their shells, to build their exoskeletons. Corals as well, they use it to build the hard reef structure that they form. And so the less carbonate ions that are available, it's harder for them to form those hard shells. All right, so next slide. So again, without having that available carbonate ions, some of the marine organisms, marine calcifiers that use that calcium carbonate to form their hard shells are going to be potentially at risk. All right, this first picture across is showing a shell that's been exposed to highly acidic water in a lab situation, and you can see that the shell is essentially deteriorating within 45 days. It's a very extreme example because the ocean the pH is just dropping slowly, but it shows what could potentially happen as the water gets more acidic. The bigger concern is things like this picture in the middle, these little circular balls, those are coccolithophores. The picture next to it are pteropods. Those are both really important plankton and phytoplankton that form the basis of the marine food web. So if we lose our plankton and our zooplankton, we lose a lot of the food sources for a lot of the marine organisms. But focusing on the corals, this last picture here is a coral reef. Again, they also use calcium carbonate to form the hard reef structure. And without that CO2, without the calcium carbonate to form those structures, they're potentially at risk as well. Next slide. Okay, so CO2, right? So ocean acidification, that's one part of the piece. The other piece of the puzzle is that temperatures are getting warmer. And again, remember, ocean acidification, warming temperatures, climate change, two separate phenomena. They're the evil twins that cause problems in the ocean, but they cause different problems. And they both cause different problems to the coral reefs. So as we just talked about increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, right? We know CO2 is increasing. As a result, it's trapping more heat and pushing more heat down on the atmosphere. So we've also seen that global temperatures are increasing. In fact, 2022 was the 6th warmest year on record. The last 19 of the last 20 years have been the warmest on record. We keep getting warmer and warmer. You can see this graphic is moving a bit quickly, but this bottom graph is showing that basically over time, each year is getting warmer and warmer compared to the long-term average over the 20th century. So our temperatures are warming overall. And so as they're getting warmer in the atmosphere, they're also getting warmer in the ocean. Again, the ocean is amazing. It absorbs a lot of our carbon, but it also absorbs a lot of our heat. It takes a lot of the heat out and helps kind of buffer some of these changes that we're seeing. But as a result, as it's taking that heat out, the ocean itself is getting warmer. So the graph we have here on the right is ocean heat content. And it's important to note that this is ocean heat content, not ocean temperature. Ocean heat content is actually the ability of the ocean to absorb the heat. Okay, so it's not the direct temperature, but it's a measurement of how warm the ocean is getting, which is important. And you can see it's broken down. There's a lot of squiggly lines here. The first set, the red, yellow lines, that's at the surface down to about 2,000 feet. And then you have the blue lines, which show the deeper in the ocean. And you can see that overall in both at the surface and below, temperatures are increasing overall. Ocean heat content is increasing, which subsequently ocean temperatures are increasing. I also like this graph because you notice that there's a lot of lines. Each one of those lines represents a different data set, which shows that different groups are taking these measurements and they're all coming up with consistent the same data, essentially, which is really showing that temperatures and heat content are changing throughout the ocean. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Okay, so why does it matter if the ocean is getting warmer? Well, with coral reefs specifically, they like warm temperatures. They live in, sorry, I'd stop for a second. And also note that when we're talking about coral reefs, we're specifically talking about shallow water reef building corals. There are deep ocean corals, which are different, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're focusing on the ones that you probably typically imagine, those really bright colored ones in warm waters, tropical waters that form in the shallow waters. So these reefs, they like warm water, but the problem is if the water, they have a very, very limited temperature range. And if the water gets too warm, the coral can become bleached. And to understand what bleaching is, they can become stressed in bleach. And to understand how that works, we need to understand what's going on with the coral. So coral is a pretty interesting little creature, organism. It's made up of individual polyps, and entire reefs are made up of thousands to millions of these polyps. That is the living part of the coral. They also, as the coral are living, they produce calcium carbonate, which forms the skeleton, which is the harder shell, the harder reef portion that the corals sit on top of. So the coral polyps, within the coral polyps, they have zooxanthellae, which is a symbiotic algae that essentially lives inside the polyp. And they have a symbiotic relationship. So the zooxanthellae have a place to live where they get lots of sunlight, and they get the CO2 and water they need to undergo photosynthesis from the polyps. And in exchange, the polyps get nutrients from the polyps, which help them survive and also help build that calcium carbonate skeleton that they need. It's also the zooxanthellae that give the corals their very vivid colors, give them those beautiful yellow, blues, reds that we see in coral reefs. And so again, the problem is when the water gets too warm, the coral polyps get stressed and they actually eject the zooxanthellae from the polyp. And as a result, the coral turns white. And so the term is referred to as chloral bleaching because it looks like it's been bleached because it's lost that very bright color. And if it becomes stressed for a long period of time, the zooxanthellae won't come back in and the coral can be really impacted by not having those zooxanthellae. So I'm going to stop here and transition over to the, who's going next? Sorry. Oh. Right. Excellent. So we'll talk about the consequences of these bleaching events.
Just out of curiosity, can people see my annotations on the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Something I learned new. I don't know how to get rid of them, but you know.
We'll leave it. It's fine.
So, hi everyone. Hope you're having a good day on this blustery but sunny day. So this is the why do we care? So Dr. Allen just went over, you know, all of the causes of this stuff, but why do we care? That's not a trick question. Can a few people throw in the chat why we might actually care? Or do we not care? Thank you, Christian. I was hoping you would jump in. Christian took environmental science with, earth science with me. But yeah, loss of biodiversity. That's the big one. Does anyone in here can throw out some reasons why biodiversity matters? Corals provide habitat for other organisms. That's another good reason. That goes back to the biodiversity. What are the benefits? What are the benefits of biodiversity? You want to throw some out there? Food chains depend on biodiversity. Yeah. So, yeah, food chains. That's a really important one. It's important for a healthy and thriving ecosystem. Excellent. What are some reasons? What are some specific reasons that humans care about biodiversity? But let's be selfish for a moment here. If we're selfish, why do humans care? We don't want to eat chicken every day. Excellent. Multiple food sources. Beautiful. I'm seeing food. And that is a big factor. And another big factor is medicine. So let's go on with the slides here. So just continuing on with this idea of bleaching, we have a picture here of, oh, go back, please. I'm sorry. We have a picture here of a bleaching event, and this is from the Great Barrier Reef. When I was doing some research for this and trying to find some data, interestingly, it was, well, not surprisingly, I was finding the most clear data on the Great Barrier Reef down near Australia here. But mass bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef have been documented with full-scale surveys in 98, 02, 2016, 2017, 2020, and 2022. So you'll notice that since 2016, the occurrences have kind of sped up there. So please go on now. Next slide. Okay. And I found this slide quite fascinating. In fact, if you go to NOAA and their Coral Reef Watch, you can actually see their analysis of current thermal conditions. And so this was from the day I was working on this presentation. This was March 6th, but this actually gets updated daily, which is quite fascinating. So the areas in red and dark red are at really high alerts because the temperatures are starting to get too warm. So because this goes back to the temperature data that Dr. Allen was talking about and the temperature consequences for corals. So this is an ongoing issue. It isn't something that just happens occasionally. And if you look at this, this is a global issue, right? This isn't just happening near Australia. Just look at the Southern Hemisphere there. There's a lot of areas that are in very high alert right now. And of course, can someone suggest maybe why the Southern Hemisphere is showing lots of high alerts right now, but we're seeing not many in the Northern Hemisphere right now? why might we not be seeing as many alerts for the Northern Hemisphere? And this relates to temperature. Seasons, yes, it is currently winter. So that would explain why we're mostly seeing these in the South for the moment. In fact, I was staring at this and it took me a minute to remember that was why the data was mostly in the Southern Hemisphere. Thank you. Next slide. And then this is just kind of reiterating from the Great Barrier Reef there. You can see a map of the Great Barrier Reef, and it's a little hard to read, at least on my screen, but we see that extreme is more than 90% cover bleached. And so this was the event from 2020. And this was the third event that year. This was the most geographically widespread bleaching event recorded yet. Okay. And then after a short recovery period in 2021, there was another one in 2022, right? And that was the fourth mass coral bleaching event in 7 years. So just kind of going on, Dr. Allen was talking about what's causing this, and I just kind of want to emphasize that these events are getting more frequent, and this is happening right now. And you can just see all the areas in red there, orange to red, orange to dark red. Orange is 31 to 60% cover bleached, and then as I said earlier, dark red is 90%, and you can just see how bad this one was. Next slide, please. So as I had you guys tell me at the beginning, when I started, we care about corals because we care about biodiversity, right? And at some level, I'd say many of us, although I know not all humans, just find corals to be beautiful, right? I mean, here's a picture of a coral reef. If you Google coral reefs, you will find so many beautiful, aesthetically pleasing pictures. And at some level, aesthetics is actually a benefit of biodiversity. As humans, we benefit from seeing beautiful things. We benefit from just the calmness and loveliness of nature. And just emphasizing the biodiversity here, coral reefs have very high biodiversity. More than 25% of all marine species are found in coral reefs, and yet they occupy less than 1% of the ocean. Okay? Every organism plays a unique role, contributes to how coral reef communities survive and function. Next slide, please. And yet, global coverage of living coral has declined by 50% since 1950. So these areas account for a ton of biodiversity, and we're seeing drastic declines since the 1950s. And as we know, those declines are actually speeding up. And you can see here, the graph on the left here is the average decadal loss and kind of an estimated baseline what we should be seeing. And then we see the graph showing the declines there. And then the map on the right is showing what the percentage of cover change is. Okay. And so a few areas are seeing a slight increase. There are some purplish areas, but for the most part, we're in the pinkish to reddish. So we're seeing an overall decline. Next slide, please. Okay. So in addition to food sources and medicine, which we mentioned, coral reefs also protect coastlines from storms and erosion. And this is one of the areas, at least for me, which is perhaps the most fascinating, because my dissertation in graduate school was actually on shoreline loss. And while I did not study tropical shorelines, this was one of the areas of research I looked into a little bit. And coral reefs actively act as buffers, protecting shorelines from storm surges. So they also help to protect our economic investments on the shorelines, okay, in tropical areas. They also provide jobs for local communities. Okay. Obviously, there's the recreation and the tourism. And of course, we know that the recreation and the tourism can also cause pollution, which can cause a decline there. For those of you who have taken environmental science, nutrient cycles, I know how much environmental science students have a love-hate relationship with nutrient cycles. And coral reefs are important for nutrient cycling. Okay? They provide income. They're part of culture. And this was fascinating to me. Over 500 million people, that's a ton of people, over 500 million people depend on reefs for food, income, and protection. And remember, coral reefs account for about 1% of the ocean, and yet over 500 million people rely on them. And so, I think I touched on all of them, and I just kind of like this picture. You know, yes, it's a poster picture here, but I love how it shows the diversity. I love the colors. Personally, I'm particularly fond of octopi, at the bottom there. Next slide, please. All right, so that is it for me. So we care because, first of all, they're beautiful living things, and we care because they do have a direct impact on our economies, our food supplies, and potentially our medicines. So thank you for your time. Oh, and there is a question in the chat, which we will get to this question about, is there a way to unbleach corals at the end?
Yes, thank you. I was just going to address that as well.
So hi, everyone. Dr. Cardona, and can you see me? I think I showed my video. So basically, what I'm going to talk about are some ways that scientists have been exploring. How do we restore the oceans that we, as you see, there's so many impacts that we've addressed here, that it's deteriorating. It could dissolve with ocean acidification. It's losing its algae because of global warming and causing it to bleach. And I saw a question about it, unbleaching. There is really no way to unbleach it. What they do is find ways to grow more polyps and restore the habitats that way. That's the main way that it's done. Keep in mind, coral polyps are animals, not plants, but we use terms like gardening and seeding, just like we do with oysters, because these are sessile benthic organisms, so they don't move like plants. So even though they're not plants, they're animals, we use terms like, you know, gardening and seeding in terms of restoration. Now, in this picture, you see a scuba diver. He is attaching the reefs piece by piece. What you can do this with cement, zip ties, and nails, which is, I know, kind of primitive, but basically, we're looking at which species are more durable, which ones will survive, more likely to survive the increase in temperature. So there's a lot of scientists all over the world doing this, from Hawaii to Australia to Florida. They're looking at ways to pick the species that are more likely to survive. And I saw a question about evolution. In a way that it's going to cause evolution. When certain species are more vulnerable and will not tolerate the change, those will become extinct, and we'll see more and more of the sturdy ones, like survival of the fittest, if you will, that will persist. But for now, we're trying to figure out ways to maintain and improve the coral reef conditions. So why do we care? Well, as Dr. Jaworski mentioned, we have food, cultural practices, and economic benefits to these reefs. We could be losing up to $10 trillion a year if we lose our coral reefs, because there's a benefit to the fisheries and harvest that we get in these locations. This is where most of the fish are found. About a fourth, 25% of fisheries are in coral reefs. That means that we lose the coral reefs, we lose an abundance of fish, which supplies about a third of the world's protein. So again, this is a $10 trillion a year economic gain globally, but for the United States alone, we get $3 billion a year from these fisheries. But we're going to lose up to 90% of these coral reefs by 2050 if we continue to have this absorption of CO2 in the water and warming temperatures. Unfortunately, even if we have a degree change of just like 1.5 degrees Celsius in the atmosphere, we're going to be losing somewhat close to 90% of our coral reefs. So how do we save them? How do we protect them? How do we prevent this loss? There are a lot of scientists doing great work and figuring out ways to garden, quote unquote, garden coral. So these are some examples of studies that are being done. They have coral trees, as they call it, which are upward vertical plantings. Then there's some more horizontal gardening methods, but basically they're trying to reproduce the polyps in a lab and put them into the ocean to see if they will grow. So that's one of the types of experiments is associated with this. They're looking at different types of species of coral and seeing which ones will last. Another really exciting project that is happening right now is called the Plant a Million Corals Foundation that Dr. David Vaughn created. He was able to plant over 100,000 corals in October, as of October 2022. What they do is they use what we call microfragmentation, which, by the way, was discovered on accident. This scientist, Dr. Vaughn, he was trying to see how coral reproduces sexually, which, by the way, only happens once a year. And he accidentally broke a piece of a coral polyp. And he was like, oh no, I killed this organism. But he discovered by looking at it that over a course of months, those fragments of the broken piece of coral were able to reproduce faster asexually, so that they were growing twice as fast through breaking the pieces apart than leaving it to natural polyp asexual reproduction. So basically breaking the coral into tiny pieces allows them to fuse together and grow up to 25 times the speed that it would in nature, but most of the time he found it to be at least twice as fast. There are some slow growing corals that reproduce sexually, and those, like I said, only reproduce once a year in summer after a full moon. So it's a very specific condition in which they time it seasonally and with the lunar cycle to reproduce sexually. So coral reefs have what we call alternating generations, which means that every other generation they reproduce either sexually or asexually. So asexually means that a polyp would break off and then grow to be a bigger polyp, and grow to be a structure for many polyps, as opposed to the sexual reproduction where there are gametes that are released. So there are two ways in which any coral can reproduce, but he found that through microfragmentation and asexual reproduction, they were able to grow them much faster in labs than in nature. So this is an example of some of these microfragments. So on the left, you see these are about 6 months old. So he broke them up into tiny pieces. Over 6 months, you get this. About a year later, you get them fused together. These are different species, but you can see more or less what he does. They fuse together and become a bigger structure with more polyps reproducing asexually this way. This other lab in Florida, what they're doing is examining ways in which polyps can reproduce sexually. And this is actually a picture of sexual reproduction. You can see that they're releasing basically the equivalents of eggs and sperm. And they can do this, but they do this again once a year. So it's very specific spawning process. And they're trying to make it happen more frequently in labs. I think they're having trouble with that portion of it. But basically, they're realizing that through microfragmentation, they can do asexual reproduction, but by the time they put them in the ocean, they're ready for that sexual maturity and spawning for that alternating generation. So we have a lot of advancements, and what they're looking at are these 4 critical criteria for restoration. First, planning and assessing their goals, figuring out what the goal is of that experiment. Identifying strategies to mitigate risk, because there are risks associated with these processes, like introduction of diseases or pollution in the water in labs. Then they have to look at stage 3, engaging local stakeholders and communities in all stages of restoration projects, because the fishing industry or tourism industry could interfere with their projects. So they have to look at who are the stakeholders who use the coral reefs and basically work with them, work together to come up with ways that they can all benefit from this, but not interrupt the science that's going on or the experiments. And stage 4 is developing long-term monitoring plans for management and effectiveness, because if it's not maintained and not studied for a long term, then that could be a resource that over time goes away. So what I mean by that, there are many studies, like ones that were done in Texas A&M in 2009-ish. They had a major hurricane that hit that area, and everything that they had done with all the restoration of the coral reefs was wiped away by a hurricane. So you have to keep consistent maintenance, consistent checking and surveillance of the studies just to make sure that they're working properly and that they're not being swept away by erosion or weather events like hurricanes. So the NOAA Coral Reef Conservation Program is another big contributor to funding and research for restoration projects. And they're looking at many strategies, including improving the habitat quality for corals because sediment can be dangerous to them. There are other things besides warmth and acidity that affect corals. Like sediments can suffocate them if there's a lot of loose sediment. So you have to look at improving the habitat, preventing the loss of coral and their habitat, enhancing coral population resistance, which looks at supporting restoration projects and how resilient are they? Can we reduce the mortality rates of the larvae, excuse me, and improving the coral health and survival, which also includes getting rid of invasive species like lionfish, which are these beautiful fish that were introduced to the Atlantic, even though they belong in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, and they eat coral reefs. They eat the coral polyps. And so because we put them in a new habitat, they don't have their natural predator and they've taken over and they eat and destroy the coral reef polyps. There are other fish that are naturally like that, like parrotfish that eat parts of the coral, but these are ones that have predators here. So their population is controlled. But lionfish are invasive because they don't have their predators. So there's way too many of them and not enough to regulate their population size. And like I said, controlling the spread of coral disease is important because there are diseases that affect marine life. And a lot of invertebrates like oysters as well also suffer from viruses and bacteria, just like humans. So we have to look at what's there and what could hurt them. Now we have time for questions. I saw there were a lot of questions popping up while I was talking, but I wasn't able to read them. Let me see, is there any immediate question that we can address?
Yeah, there's a lot of good ones.
Is it starting with question? Is it possible the polyps will evolve over time to be able to exist in warmer waters? Possibly. Again, this is a survival of the fittest situation, right? So we're looking at some species are not tolerating the change and they will die. Others are resilient and those will probably end up taking over. And so those genes become the genes that get passed on from generation to generation. So in a way, that is evolution. When you have extinction of other species and ones survive, they evolve and adapt to those changes. So yes, there is definitely a possibility for that. And we're seeing that. The next question, how long is the growth process for coral reefs to reach maturity? In nature, it would be multiple years. Through these processes, they're taking like 2 years to do it. But keep in mind, coral reefs actually live for centuries. So these are organisms that are very old and live for a very, very long time. But they don't really reproduce. So let me put it this way. Sexual reproduction, when they're mature enough and reproduce sexually, they do it only once a year. And only 1 in a million survive every 10 to 100 years. So it's very, very risky reproduction. Basically, they don't reproduce very much because they survive for so long that they shouldn't have to reproduce as quickly. Does that make sense? I hope. So basically what I'm trying to say is that these organisms live for a very long time. So they tend to only reproduce 1 out of 1 billion eggs every 10 to 100 years, if they do it sexually. Yeah, so I see that Jenny, Dr. Allen mentioned that coccoliths first, which are the plankton, the calcareous plankton, they're adapting to the changes and facing these changes, which is good because they're the bottom of the food chain for a lot of organisms. Can we garden them at home, of course, in water and then donate it to organizations? So a lot of these organizations do depend on citizen science and people doing work for them, but they prefer to do everything under controlled conditions in laboratories with specific pH and specific salinity and temperatures. So I'm not sure that there are any programs that take homegrown coral, but you can look into it. There are a lot of organizations asking for volunteers that scuba dive to help with their projects to actually plant and seed or garden these polyps. And then Leah asked, does this impact the coral's genetic diversity? I feel like I'm answering all these questions that Dr. Jaworski or Dr. Allen, do you want to take over any point? I know that I'm the oceanographer, but let me know if you want to answer any of these questions. So it would definitely affect genetic diversity, but the more genetic diversity we have in corals, the better chance we have of survival. So there will die, some species will die out, and that does limit the species diversity, which in turn would limit genetic diversity, if that makes sense. So when they plant new coral to restore the coral reefs, do they do anything with the bleached coral or dead coral and like remove it? No, because new baby polyps and larvae depend on the old dead coral to remove calcium carbonate from the water and extract it and be able to grow their own exoskeletons. Very similarly to oysters, you need to recycle oyster shells so that oysters can latch on to the old oyster shells and be able to secrete calcium carbonate from it and build their own shells. With gardening, the coral reefs, are we decreasing global warming as well? Not hugely. Because it all depends on the algae that latches onto the polyps. The algae are the photosynthesizers. So the corals themselves respire and actually add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and to the water, more to the water, because water is a universal solvent and dissolves the carbon dioxide from fish and respiring organisms as well. I'm seeing a comment. The problem with stakeholders is when they become involved, it becomes more of an economic gain for self than legal battle arises. There are disputes, there are issues associated with that. So does the coral reefs take on the process of eugenics? Well, Anna, Jenny, do you want to add to that?
I would just say not really. I mean, I feel like that's more of a human concept. We have to be careful when applying human concepts to natural processes.
Right. So eugenics is referring to the weeding out. I mean, technically, evolution and survival of the fittest does that, but it's not the same thing as eugenics.
Yeah, that, and of course eugenics gets into a fairly complicated social things, and of course corals don't have society.
We're also not necessarily selecting, I mean, we're selecting certain corals in the sense of what's going to be able to grow and adapt well when it gets put back into the nature, but that's in order to help them survive, right? So it's a slippery slope, but I'm not sure it would really fall under that.
And that's a really good point. One of the complications with any restoration project is deciding what should go back. And making those decisions are very complicated. Making sure that we are considering the ecosystem and not just human interests. And then being careful to make sure that we are considering current conditions and not necessarily what was there before. Obviously, in an ideal world, we would be able to put back what was there before, but as Christina just mentioned, as the climate is changing, what survived 10 years ago may not survive today. So anytime we're doing habitat restoration, whether it's on land or in water, it's a fairly complicated process, and there are no simple answers.
There's too many variables to address in nature, just like there are too many variables In humans, like you look at health studies, we can't say coffee will kill you or be good for you without certainty, because there's so many other variables affecting each human that consumes coffee, if that makes sense. So there's too many variables in nature. So that's why they try to do these experiments under controlled conditions in labs, so they can remove some of these extra variables that could affect it. I also saw my hands had a question. Are fertilizers used to increase the growth rates? I don't think so, because the fertilizers will only help the algae grow, not the animal, that's the coral itself. I didn't see anything in the research that showed that they were using fertilizers, because it's really a symbiotic relationship between the coral polyp and the algae. The coral produces the nutrients and the carbon dioxide that the algae needs to grow, and the algae produces the dissolved oxygen, and it can be food for the polyp itself. So there's really no need for fertilizers. In fact, if you look at where coral reefs are located, the water is crystal clear. You can see to the bottom in tropical systems, because they're called oligotrophic environments. They actually have very little, they're basically poor nutrient environments. So using fertilizers is totally unnecessary for this process. I see a question. Is there any relationship between plastic pollution and the damage being done to coral reefs? It doesn't help. So plastics don't degrade. They really they don't go away. They photodegrade. Light breaks them down to tiny little pieces that we call microplastics. So those could be mistaken for food by fish and corals, because they're animals again. So it could be problematic as microplastics that could become a food source accidentally for the coral that thinks it's algae that's eating. So it does add to it, but it's just not as big of an issue right now as the warming and the acidification, if that makes sense. I'm seeing, how do we go about controlling the algae affecting the coral reefs? Well, really, it comes down to temperature control, and we can't really change the temperature of the ocean at this point, because there's so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that it is causing warming in the atmosphere and causing warming in the water as well, as you saw in a previous slide that Dr. Allen showed here. Oops, I went too far. You can see that the temperatures, the heat is increasing, and that it even in the ocean depths of like upwards to 6,000 feet, so there's really no way to prevent bleaching other than stop carbon dioxide emissions, which we all know it's not going to happen completely, but we could reduce the effect by reducing large amounts of emissions. Of course, even with the current changes that we're seeing, we're going to lose a lot of the current corals. So that's why all these restoration projects are important. Go ahead, Dr. Allen.
I just wanted to follow up on the question about the bleaching and if it can be reversed. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was if the conditions aren't too bad and don't stay bad for a long time, the zooxanthellae will reestablish in the corals, right? So it can reverse, but only if it's for a short, not very drastic period of time, right? And the longer the bleaching event occurs, the less likely it is to recover.
Thank you for bringing that up. That is true. With some of the major bleaching events we saw in the Great Barrier coral reefs in Australia, we did see that there was a really bad year in 2016, like Dr. Jaworski pointed out, but it kind of re-established itself afterwards. But then we also had another major event the next year. So it all depends on how consistently bad the warming is. If it comes down and stabilizes, then it does re-establish itself. That's true. Thank you, Dr. Allen. The next question is there any, are harmful algal blooms a problem? Yes. Harmful algal blooms, HABs is a term used for several dozen species of plankton that produce neurotoxins and are harmful to animals. That's where a lot of human diseases come from, like shellfish poisoning or parasitic shellfish poisoning. So if we eat an oyster or a mussel that had eaten that algae, we could die. Similarly, the coral polyps could eat harmful algae, which could make it sick. That's one of the sources of coral diseases that they're addressing in the strategies mentioned later in the slides. So when we were talking about making sure their habitat was good, that's one of the things they look for. So cutting down on fertilizer emissions, which I think was what you're getting at, Mike, would definitely help reduce the hazardous algal bloom that could kill coral. On top of that, if you have a bloom on the surface of the water, that's going to block sunlight. So the algae that's living on the coral would suffer and wouldn't be able to photosynthesize. So yes, in many ways, it's a problem. Are there any downsides to microfragmentation, and do any of these downsides outweigh the benefits of microfragmentation? So like I said, that microfragmentation started as an accident, but as a true scientist, he was like, well, I saw it grow more. Let's see if that happens every time. So he started using an X-Acto knife and cutting different pieces of coral and saw that it just kept on growing. As far as we understand it so far, there don't seem to be any downsides to that. We're just kind of pushing its reproductive cycle so that it goes faster. I haven't found enough evidence to say that there are any downsides, and if there are, they're not going to outweigh the benefits. Are there any other questions? So I have to, just to make sure, I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now because I'm going to share a survey link with everyone here before it's too late. So if you would like, any student that answers this survey of what you thought of this event, I'm going to put it in the chat. Hopefully the links go through. Seems like the event link didn't actually go through. Let me just try that again. This is a survey that if you fill it out, you can be entered to win gift certificates to different bookstores and cool things like that. So that's the second link I sent. It's a very, very short survey. So please take your time to fill that out. There are some other questions here that popped up. Nope, never mind. Well, does anyone have any more questions that would like to have answered?
Is anything we missed from earlier in the chat? We weren't ignoring it intentionally.
I am.
I think Dr. Cardona did a great job covering all the questions.
I think she did get most of them.
Sorry about that. I was trying to just make sure I got everyone. So if there's anything else we want to add, this is it. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you learned a lot about coral reefs and related topics to the book Under a White Sky. And keep an eye out for future events from the Community Book Connection, which includes a boat trip on May 4th, which is a Friday, sorry, but it's a Friday all-day trip on a boat and canoe with me and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and you get to learn about similar issues that affect oysters and our local fisheries here in the Chesapeake Bay, including algal blooms, fertilizer, and some of the things that were discussed today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jaworski.
Thank you to our interpreters for spending the time with us today.
Yes, thank you, Sharon and Erica. Have a great day, everyone. Audrey, sorry. I didn't mean to miss you there.